welcome all of you to the 9th Bergen Exchanges on Law and Social Transformation. I believe Tønnessen and we are the co-directors of LawTransform, and we're just super thrilled that this day event sort of came.
Definitely. After 2 years of pandemic, we are very, very happy to see so many familiar faces and some new faces in the audience. And I cannot wait for a full week of very, very interesting panels. I put my golden shoes on. I'm ready to go.
I think we're all so ready. And it's really, really wonderful to see you all here. And of course, we're not in I know some of you went to where we always are, at the CMI Law School building, University of Bergen CMI building, Bergen Global. And we will be back there next year, but it's under renovation. And of course, it might be difficult to go back because this is an amazing place. Okay, so we have 30 different events in the course of the week. And as always, it's a tight program with lots of highlights. And I hope many of you are able to stay for everything. But before we get started properly, we have a welcome from our different institutions, because the Central Law and Social Transformation, LawTransform, which is the main host of the Bergen Exchanges, but with many collaborators that you will find in the program. We are co-owned by the University of Bergen, the Faculty of Law and the Faculty of Social Sciences, where we're based at the Department of Government, and the Michelsen Institute. And Lise is the co-director from the Michelsen Institute, and I'm the co-director from the university. And to welcome us, we have the first welcome will be given by the Vice Rector for Research at the University of Bergen, Benedicte Carlsen.
On behalf of the university, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the Bergen Exchange on Law and Social Transformation 2022. For almost a decade, this annual event has been a unique platform for scholars and practitioners alike to meet across borders and disciplines to enhance our common understanding of law as an instrument of change. At the University of Bergen, academic freedom, interdisciplinarity, and internationalization are among our core values that shape everything we do at our institution. Through interdisciplinarity and internationalization, we create a diversity of experiences, ways of thinking, and approaches that strengthen the quality of our scholarly work. And by exercising our academic freedom, we can freely challenge the ways we see the world and then change it for the better. With this in mind, I'm very excited to see precisely this free expression of ideas in the seminars in the coming days. We will see discussions on important topics ranging from child protection services to citizenship, from climate litigation to abortion rights, and from indigenous rights to child marriage. And all of this with scholars and practitioners from different disciplines, cultures, and intellectual traditions. One of the nicest things about these types of events is that we get to see old friends and colleagues from partner universities. The annual lecture this year will be held by Professor Silvia Tamale from Makerere University, which is having its 100 years anniversary this year. I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate Professor Tamale and Makerere University on their anniversary. For over 30 years, the University of Bergen and Makerere University has had a close partnership in both research and student and scholarly exchanges. So we congratulate you all for all you have achieved in this past century of academic work. And we wish you all the best in the coming 100 years as well. And on that note, I would like again to wish you all welcome to Bergen and the best of luck in the discussions you will have in the coming days. Thank you very much.
Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce the next round of welcome from Torunn Wimpelmann, Research Director at CMI.
Thank you, Liv. Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad on behalf of CMI to be able to welcome you all to the opening of 2022 Bergen Exchanges on Law and Social Transformation. I'm particularly grateful to all the great scholars, activists, and professionals who have traveled to Bergen from across the globe, in many cases traversing not just long flights, but also hostile visa regimes. I think the last few years have really taught us how precious such meetings are. And I'm sure as the week goes on, we will all be reminded of how important it is to savor these moments and the energy and insight that comes from interacting with colleagues and with friends, as many of us have become over the years. This is, I believe, the 9th Bergen Exchange. But of course, the Bergen history of research and engagement with law and social change dates back much longer. And for its part, CMI started its first human rights research program in 1983. And although I sometimes think of the center of law and social transformation as CMI's edgy, energetic younger sister, there is a lot of synergies in the themes of this year's Bergen Exchange and our CMI's research focus. We have research groups called Rights and Gender, Climate and Natural Resources, and Democracy and Governance. And to see so many lectures, roundtables, and interviews on topics such as autocratization, anti-corruption, abortion rights, and so many other of CMI's research, core research, really reinforces how important an event the Bergen Exchanges is to CMI. However, I'm really particularly appreciative to see this year that Bergen Exchanges are putting global knowledge regimes on the agenda. As a northern institution doing research in the global south, CMI cannot escape the fact that our very existence is steeped in global relations of inequality. And what this should mean for us in an institution is something that requires constant reflection. And I really look forward to the inspiration and insight that Professor Sylvia Tamale's annual lecture, Rerouting Knowledge Production, surely will generate. Many of the events focus on the use of courts and the law for repression and control, whether sexual, political, or economic control. And it seems to be a sign of our times that the study of law and social transformation now found itself, to a larger extent, studying the restrictions of rights rather than their expansion. And as researchers, professionals, and activists, we are, of course, very differently positioned in relation to these developments. Some of us feel these developments urgently, even as existential, working in places where research is increasingly framed as being national traitors, and where activism or exercise is one's profession, risk prison, exile, or worse. Other amongst us are merely observers and potential allies. But I think we all share the perception that the times ahead will be turbulent and testing in ways that we did not imagine just a few years back. And in such times, coming together to reflect, to share and compare experiences, to assess and devise strategies seems so important. And I know this week is something that many at CMI look forward to for months. And they, as me, we know Bergen Exchange as a place of intellectual generosity and an opportunity not just for immense learning, but also to take home a sense of community and support in the endeavors that we undertake. Of course, none of this happens without labor, and lots of it. So I want to give a big thank you to all the core people behind this, Siri and Lise, Lara, Gedra, Matea, and all the volunteers. And without your efforts for months, none of this would take place. Of course, we're a little bit sad that we couldn't be at Bergen Global this year, although it's very nice to be here, but I do urge you not to be too comfortable, because for the 10-year anniversary, we also like to see you all back at Bergen Global. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Torunn. The third and last formal welcome is from the Dean of the Law School, Karl Harald Søvig.
Dear all, first of all, thank you to Siri and Lise for all your efforts. I know it's a lot of hard work, so thank you very much, and also to the volunteers. You have done a great job. The topic, law, or the overall for this project, is law and social transformation. Of course, as a lawyer, I'm very interested in the law, but I realize that law has its boundaries, and therefore it's so important to have this kind of seminar where you investigate the interplay between law and social transformation. I must admit, as a lawyer, that normally social transformation is taking place, and then you have the legislation running afterwards. But from time to time, it is the opposite. I mean, from Norway, one of the few examples is when we had a ban on smoking in restaurants and so on. The general public was not in favor of such a ban, but when it came into force, everyone applauded it. And moving to another example, which is also touching upon gender and sexuality, we had in Norway, when we had the legislation that introduced same gay relations. Formerly it was first not a marriage, but it was a partnership. Then the general public was against it, but the parliament pushed it through. And today we see that this is something that we find natural. And there are other issues that we can touch upon, especially this year. It's 50 years since homosexuality was punishable according to the Norwegian Criminal Act. This was abolished 50 years ago. A bit too late, many will claim. And we can move into all these issues about gender and sexuality, which is very important for the individual. And we have the kind of large issues for the society, democracy, autocratization, and so on. I think that we all have this kind of imagination that it's moving in the wrong direction. But on the other hand, if you go into all the details, there are positive signs as well. So it's important to have a kind of thorough analysis. And when it comes to gender, it's also interesting to see the gender balance here in the audience. It is changing, and it's fascinating to see that when the same, if you go to law school, about 70% of the students are female, and that has been a shift for the last 20 years. I just briefly looked through the program, and I would say thank you very much, because it's very interesting. The sad thing about being a dean that I have to attend some budget conferences and so on. That's also part of life. but I wish you good luck with the program, because it is really both interesting and important for the society and for the academics. So thank you very much and good luck with the seminar.
Thank you so much. And for us at LawTransform, it's really important to have these different feet in both at the university between the social sciences and the law, because that is the interdisciplinarity that is so important to us, but also in the other faculties. We have actually members from across the university, and also, of course, to have CMI, which has this long-standing research, as Torunn was saying, into so many areas of the world, with colleagues from so many parts of the world, and with a very long tradition looking at different uses of rights and law, including rights language. So with this, we're actually at the point that I know that very many of you, including the two of us, haven't really been looking forward to, which is the opening keynote for today. And the opening keynote for today is by McCann. And for those of you who work in the area of socio-legal studies, this is one of the stars that are really, I mean, that we've read and engaged with, and that many of us just have been so thrilled to and looked so much forward to listening to. And those of us who have had the chance to do that before are looking even more forward to listening to Professor McCann. So Professor McCann is Gordon Hirabashi, Professor Emeritus at the University of Washington. He's a professor of political science. He has established the field of social legal research in Seattle, but also very central in a pioneer in establishing this field globally. His 1994 book on Right to Work was a very seminal work early that very many of us engaged with. And his latest work on Filipino labor activists in the US that came at University of Chicago Press in 2020 is all bringing this field, this interdisciplinary field of different uses of rights and law forward. And particularly sort of the study as legal rhetoric, the scientific study of sort of legal discourse as a field of power is something that we really owe a lot to Professor McCann. So today, Professor McCann will sort of speak to the one of the main topics of today's Bergen exchanges, democracy and autocratization dynamics, with a lecture that has the title Racial Capitalism, Legal Absurdity, Autocratic Tendencies, and the Politics of Rights. So with that, please welcome Michael McCann.
Thank you very much for that very warm welcome. I'm very excited to be here. I have known about the Bergen exchanges for a number of years and had planned to try and come. And in fact, I think that I had organized to come a couple of years ago, the first year of COVID, and couldn't do that. I have participated by Zoom before, but this is something I have wanted to do for a number of years, and I'm very glad that I can be here. And I want to especially thank Siri and the incredible staff, Laura and others, for organizing this, for making my trip possible and actually rather easy. I know it's a big job to coordinate these things. I've put on a lot of big conferences, and I've been really, really impressed by the level of work you've done, the level of communication, and the thoughtfulness that goes into the program itself. So I look forward to spending the next few days talking about this long list of really, really important issues. I should say I was introduced as Professor Emeritus. I retired 3 weeks ago. But I'm not retiring. I've got two new books underway, and I have a big political project on climate change. So I'm just not being paid for it anymore, which is okay. But this is the first talk I've given as an emeritus retired professor, whatever that means. I'm retiring, but I'm not done. That's one way to put it. Okay, so the title of my talk is been going through changes. This whole talk's been going through changes. I began to write a talk last week and then realized I had some other talks that I'd given, so I just began to piece them together. It's going to be a long talk, but I will try and keep it within the time that was allotted to me, pretty close to that. And it's going to cover a lot of ground very quickly. I tend to speak quickly, but hopefully we can break it out. And I have a very detailed PowerPoint. I think it's probably better just to listen and not try and read it all. Again, this is done for another purpose. But title: Racial Capitalism, Legal Hybridity, Autocratic Tendencies, and the Politics of Rights. I'm going to begin. What I want to talk about is context. Most of my scholarship over the last 100 years or whatever has been about the politics of rights. People claiming rights, struggles for rights against various forms of hierarchical domination. Racial domination, class domination, gender, sexual domination, and a variety of other topics. And I've always emphasized that one needs to look at context. The context in particular, the legal, institutional, and discursive context in which struggles take place, both in a very general sense, but also very particular, but also the context of those who are engaged in struggle itself. So I'm going to talk a lot today about context, about the changing context in a larger historical perspective, about changes in legal orders. And I'm covering a lot of ground, but it's all going to be about thinking about challenges as they develop at different historical moments for a politics of rights, for people claiming rights, and the challenges and obstacles that are posed. So let me begin with, and a lot of this is going to begin with the US, but it's going to try and generalize it to the global north and then to the broader globe. And by the end, I will make connections between what's happened in the US with the rise of autocratic legalism and elsewhere around the world. So let me begin with a commonplace statement about the American legal tradition, which is the US has a liberal constitutional tradition. That's part of the exceptional myth that Americans have believed for a long time. Louis Hartz wrote a very famous book called The Liberal Tradition in America. That America's always been a liberal society, with a few exceptions like slavery and so forth. But nevertheless, it's been a liberal legal tradition. When one looks at the legal order, that it's a liberal legal tradition. And that's just been a kind of commonplace. And, you know, and that was heightened to some degree, I think, by post-World War II era, when the US tried to make itself into the model for liberalization, liberal constitutional reorganizing, and a politics of rights around the world. As Tom Ginsburg, eminent comparative legal scholar, said, in the wake of World War II, liberal constitutionalism emerged as the default design of political systems in Europe and North America. That the United States played an active role in trying to remake law around the world in the image of how it imagined itself as a liberal constitutional regime. Now, what's important about that is that in the recent period, of course, many liberal constitutionalists, or whatever you want to call them, liberals, have been very concerned about the rise of what's often called populism or autocratic legalism, and there's other titles, and I'll give you some of those titles. I don't have a favorite among them, but I think they're all trying to get at the same thing. That it is challenging liberal constitutionalism, breaking down the liberal constitutional order, and posing new threats and dangers and obstacles to claiming rights for citizens. And I agree with that, you know, about the ways in which populism, autocratic legalism has arisen to pose new threats, dangers, and obstacles to rights claiming. But I disagree a little bit with Ginsburg. Now, I don't want to criticize Tom Ginsburg, but this, because he represents a very standard kind of approach. And he would probably agree with a lot of what I'm going to say. And what's important about that standard approach, I have a long quote here from them, but let me just point out what's important about it, is that, well, everybody recognizes that not everybody traditionally has had rights in the United States, that there are manifest forms of legal hierarchy and exclusion, race, gender, class, sexuality, nationality, ethnicity, religious, and so forth. But those all represent kind of the incomplete triumph of liberalism, as if it's kind of a teleology that liberalism is always kind of working its way towards dominance or hegemony. It's kind of a positive story. And there's something to that, but I want to treat hierarchy exclusion as not exceptional to or outside of the constitutional order in the United States, in the global north generally, and increasingly around the world, but in fact, hierarchy and exclusion as intrinsic to and mutually constitutive of liberalism. So let me talk about this, and I'm going to put on my Marxist mask for a moment. A lot of people have written in the last 20 years about the ways in which racial hierarchy in particular is embedded within American society, always has been. In particular, I point out Desmond King and Roger Smith have written a lot about what they called racial orders in American society, where they basically argue that there's always been two dominant kinds of political orders or political coalitions. One committed to white supremacy, and the other committed to egalitarian transformation. And you can sort of think about American society, the history of contestation is between white supremacists and those who are challenging white supremacy in the name of equality or liberal egalitarianism. And this is a very important understanding, but it's basically rooted in an understanding of coalition politics, that for them, the racial orders are about coalition politics. And that goes on, that's very important, and I've actually written about that some, but they don't say much about law. They don't say much about the ways in which racial and other kinds of exclusion and hierarchy have been built into American law from the very beginning, and continue to play out even in the contemporary day in very, very important kinds of ways. And that's what I want to talk a lot about today. They also don't talk about, when they talk about race, they don't talk about capitalism at all. They don't talk about hierarchies of wealth and control over property and means of production and relationship between owners and workers, all those kinds of things. That just sort of gets excluded from the picture about different racial orders. And that takes me to the sort of dominant way that I think about American history. And I worked this out in a book I wrote, published a couple years ago called Union by Law. I've been working on it all my career, I should say, but I kind of brought it all together then. And using the concept of racial capitalism. Racial capitalism begins from a sort of more material understanding about liberalism, that there are two contradictions at the heart of the liberal constitutional order. One is the proper contradiction or the conflict between property class inequality versus formal equality. One goes back to Marx's On the Jewish Question, is that the premise of formal legal equality, that everybody's equal under the law, is belied by the fact that some people have more social power, by the social question. And those who have more social power exercise their power in a way that turns the promise of formal legal equality into what he called an illusion. I don't want to call it a total illusion. I think that's too dismissive or too critical. But nevertheless, a conflict between social inequality that's at the heart of property society, and especially because in American society and much of northern racial capitalist regimes, property is the first right. Property is the right that grounds everything else. And it's the right of property owners that end up undermining or overtaking rights of people in the political sphere. Marx talked about that, the political rights or the rights in the political sphere are political lion skin. They seem like they empower everybody, seem very egalitarian, but in fact, they're pretty much a sham. Again, I think that's too extreme, but it's a very important insight to bear in mind. The second point about racial white capitalism is that expanded with racialization. Racialization was inherited from Europe and elsewhere in the American polity, and was developed by settler colonialism, about which I've written a lot. But race became very important. Race became important to mark those people who were the outsiders to society, who had less property, less political power, less standing, less respect, less status as rights-bearing members of the community. Race became a way of excluding those people and marking them for an unequal second-rate or third-rate status next to white property owners. So and there's been written a lot about that. There's my book, Union by Law, down in the end if you but a lot of people have written about this. And then I'm going to add a little bit here from political theorist Nancy Fraser, who basically gives us a picture about a fragmented, fractured, hybrid legal system in American society. On one hand, you've got white property owners who get liberal law. Liberalism exists historically, but that's mostly for white property owners, white male property owners. And then white wage earners tend to get an exploited status within that system, may have formal rights, may have rights of privacy, may have rights to political participation, but they are in a second level situation of power or of unequal power. And then you have an array of other groups of unwaged, like slaves, or low-waged, and racialized and gendered working class members of the working class, proletariat, if you will, who are expropriated, whose labor is taken for profit, and who are managed through specific mechanisms of what I call repressive law, which they don't get liberal law, what they get are particular kinds of repressive law that are specifically targeted at those groups by their status as racialized or gendered or ethnic minority workers. And you can think about that. I mean, that slavery wasn't just outside of the liberal constitutional regime. Slavery was its own body of law. There was slave law, which is a complex and intricate body of law that existed as part of the larger legal order within American society for hundreds of years, and was not outside and forgotten. It was very, very much, it was part of what the whole process was about. It was mutually constitutive. The development of American capitalism depended on slavery. Slavery enabled profit and capital accumulation in the American South, which then fueled Northern industrialization and westward expansion. I go into that, but most of you are probably somewhat familiar with that. So slave codes were a body of law that sat alongside the liberal constitutional order for white property owners. But then slavery was eventually overcome, but then you have Jim Crow, which again is another body of law, separate from, although mutually constitutive and interdependent with liberal law. And then you have different law for 3 waves of Asian immigrant conscripted workers: Chinese, Japanese, and Filipinos. I read a lot about this in the most recent book. New bodies of law were created for all of them to give them a different status in the larger legal order, which was outside of the liberal legal order. They did not have full rights. In many cases, they didn't have rights. They had to fight for rights that again, white property owners had. But, again, you have these bodies of law specifically for racialized minority low-wage workers. And then you have different body of laws for Native Americans, indigenous people in the West, and then for Mexican Americans. Mexicans who were also conscripted to provide low-wage labor, especially in the American West, and then throughout the rest of the country. And then you have women who were also subjected to different laws. They were different laws. They weren't just, forgotten by liberal law. They were specifically targeted, the whole body of constitutional law that designate that women are not full rights-bearing citizens. They belong in the household. They have specific functions. They play a role in capitalist economy and domestic production, reproduction, and so forth. But they were separate. So rather than thinking about the United States, and we can talk later about Europe and others, as having a single liberal tradition, we have, in fact, a fractured, multidimensional legal orders. And in fact, and all these people who are excluded with their own separate bodies are not exceptions. These are not momentary exceptions. They were built into the whole design from the very beginning. They were intrinsic to it. You wouldn't have the liberal legal order structuring capitalism if you didn't have these other bodies of law. They were not outsiders to law. They were very much inside law, but they were not inside liberal law. They were inside law made particularly for them. And so all this sort of developed in the context of cellular colonialism, which was a form of colonialism which owed to European colonialism, but was also a bit different in ways that I don't have time to talk about here. But nevertheless, cellular colonialism was committed to extraction of land and resources and expropriation of labor in the West. The extraction of land and resources primarily from indigenous peoples, and then the conscription of people that will either be slaves or to be low-wage workers, as mostly non-white workers. And constitutional statutory law facilitated this. There's a lot of great stuff about the ways in which law constructed cellular colonialism and facilitated that. And what I came to realize in working on this a few years ago is you could think about this as a dual legal system, although it's much more complicated than that, it's much more fractionated. But there's one body of law, again, for white property owners, and there's these other bodies of law for these other populations that are, that condemn them to less than full rights type of status. And I began thinking about Ernst Frankel's famous book on the dual legal system in Germany and about the parallels. And then I read a book that really was stunning to me by Wimpelmann called Hitler's American Model of Law, where he showed that Hitler actually, in his cronies, his legal advisors, looked to American Jim Crow law to imagine what their legal system might be. in all kinds of ways, subordinating a population to second or third class, nearly slave status. And that was based on the American model, which would be quite shocking to most Americans. Even to me, who've been working on this for a long time, I said, oh, really? That makes sense, and so forth. And then I began thinking also about Maren Henrik's work on South Africa and dual and hybrid legal orders. So I usually think about this in terms of dual legal orders, although the one legal order is a much more complex, fractionated kind of order. Okay, and the other thing that's important here is that divisions become geopolitical with the expansion of racial capitalism. It ossifies into dualisms between the white world and the non-white world, between the North and the South, between the colonizers and the colonized. And this becomes a kind of global model which spreads with what we call racial capitalism. By the way, racial capitalism is too simplistic. It should be racial, patriarchal, heteronormative capitalism, but that's just too many words. So anytime I say racial capitalism, that builds in assumptions about patriarchy and about heteronormativity, and we can build in other things about religion as well too. But I use racial capitalism as do many people. So we get this sort of model. When I wrote this book about the Philippines, it begins with the US. It begins with settler colonialism and the march of white people to take land across the West and removal of indigenous people and expropriation of labor from Mexicans and Asians and so forth. And then the colonial venture into the Philippines. So the United States invaded the Philippines, kicked out the Spanish who'd been previous colonizers, and then promised the Filipinos that they would have their own liberal legal order, that they could rule themselves, but then the United States changed its mind and said, no, how about if we rule you for a while because we don't think you're ready, and imposed a new kind of legal order, very much in the style of European colonialism. So the United States played out both these histories of European-style colonialism and settler colonialism to some degree. And what that means is when one thinks about the politics of rights struggles, it's not just about rights claims against other rights claims. It's just not the rights claims of slaves against white property owners or the rights claims of women against men. It's about fighting within different legal orders, from one legal system to another, which complicates and makes it much more problematic. A lot of times it's about people who are outside of the liberal legal order claiming liberal legal rights to become part of that order, but a lot of times it's also challenging that liberal legalism themselves, says we just don't want to be part of this, we want something different. So it complicates that story. Now, of course, all this, there's not a clock in here, is there? Am I? Well, 15 more? Oh, that's perfect. Okay, that'll be good. I'll just talk fast. Okay, and then of course with World War II, and this is where we began with Tom Ginsburg's observation, this history of racial capitalism, of multiple legal orders for differently situated people, to some degree is subjected to this larger process of liberalization. In the wake of the Holocaust and fascism and the commitment that we can't let this happen again, there's a commitment to bringing something like liberal or Republican legal institutions and discourses in remaking states. And that was usually bringing in some form of divided powers that would check and balance each other into governmental schemes, usually about empowering the courts to play a role in securing those limitations on governmental institutions, and also about guarantees of basic rights. There's a lot of variation in all of this, but nevertheless, there are general patterns of liberal constitutionalization. And that goes along with what we often talk about as the judicialization of politics in the post-war era. And that's what Ginsburg meant, that liberal constitutionalism became the default choice for political systems around the world. And we see the manifestations of that. They were dramatic in lots of ways, and I certainly don't want to minimize them. The United States, we had the civil rights movement and the due process revolution, as it's often called, although it certainly wasn't a revolution, but it was significant changes that shouldn't be discounted. We see the spread of liberal constitutionalism across Europe. South Africa, we see the challenge to apartheid that takes a long time, but nevertheless can be imagined, and Maren Henrik's book is useful in that way, about how a liberal order coexisted with an illiberal order and how that to some degree over time played into transformations of the illiberal order in somewhat more liberal directions. See anti-colonial movements around the world, and the explosion of human rights mobilization and judicialization. All this takes place after World War II in response to the developments before then. But what I want to emphasize is that the basic tenets of racial capitalism didn't really change. There's a lot of change in legal orders and that matter for the rights of people and for the welfare and possibilities of social justice. New opportunities were created for people who'd been excluded and subjected to these illiberal forms of order beforehand, nevertheless to challenge that and to either become part of the larger liberal order and in the process change the liberal order itself. Because when new people join, new groups join that liberal order, it becomes a different order and lots of new kinds of dynamics. So I don't want to minimize that. But nevertheless, two fundamental contradictions remained. Formal liberal formal equality that was granted to more and more people, formal rights, didn't necessarily, and in many cases not very much at all, like in the United States, didn't really bring with it a transformation in social relations and social power. Is that while we have more formal equality and more formal rights for people, that there is no fundamental redistribution of economic power, economic wealth, social status, organizational power, and so forth. So we get an increasing legal equality, but not a same degree or character of change in social equality. We have conflict. Again, it's the same thing that Marx talked about in an earlier period, a little bit different, but we can think about it that way. The second thing is that the older forms of illiberal law, or what I call repressive law, don't go away, but they get repackaged. And this is most prominent in the US, about which I know the most, is a repressive law continues, but it's repackaged to fit the principles of legal proceduralism and formal rights. No longer is our broad tenets of law, of repressive law, explicitly racist, explicitly gendered, explicitly about religion, that there is a kind of new emphasis on proceduralism and legal neutrality. But nevertheless, we have these bodies of law that are still committed to order management, which is disproportionately applied to the same populations generally that were applied to beforehand. In the United States, of course, the key here is about criminalization, the expansion of the criminal legal order, the expansion of policing, surveillance, mass incarceration, crimmigration, the criminalization of the immigration system. My book, Union by Law, is a lot about that because it's about 3 waves of Asians, so forth. Disparate housing laws which basically continue to discriminate against people of color and immigrant populations, but don't do that explicitly. It's all done to look formally equal and neutral, but in fact, we can see the patterns of discrimination that are going on. The difference between what we often talk about in American equal protection law between intentional discrimination and discriminatory impact. A lot of discriminatory impact, even though it wasn't overtly on its face, discriminatory. And then also workplace. I have a particular interest in workers and low-wage workers, women, immigrants, workers of color, and the ways in which the workplace itself is also a sphere of repressive law. American law, while there are some advances in American law on behalf of workers, providing protections at the workplace of rights, speech, rights to organize and unions, all that begins being whittled away right away by the 1940s. Rights to organize are whittled away, rights of free speech, and the rights of employers increasingly expanded once again, basically run workplaces the way that they want. I put up here one recent book, which I like a lot, Private Government. I mean, the workplace is basically a private government, and employers are basically autocrats. They can do, in the United States at least, they can do what they want to do. They can fire you for the clothes you wear, for the religion you belong to, for speech at work. If they don't like anything about you, it's fairly arbitrary. And while there are standards of non-discrimination, they're very hard to enforce, and they're not really realized practicality. That's much of my own work over the last 40 years has been about the way in which those formal rights often don't add up to social protections and social empowerment. So we get this sort of repackaging of traditional forms of law. And a lot of people who study criminal law look to the fact that a lot of the practices and organization of criminal law is inherited from slave law, is a reproduction of slavery. The phrase I often use when I teach undergraduates, that the ghosts of slavery still haunt our criminal justice system. So that they look more formally equal and liberal on the surface, but in effect, they are still aimed at particular populations and substantially sustain these forms of hierarchy and inequality. And liberalism, to some degree, provides a kind of rationalizing or legitimating mask for those forms of organization. Now, none of this is to say that political struggles for rights still haven't continued in the post-war era, as we get from the initial surge of liberalism to immediately reaction that we often identify with neoliberalism, there's still lots of struggles for rights. Most of my career has been about talking about people who have been struggling for rights in the United States and elsewhere in the post-war era, amidst this sort of, after the surge in liberalism and amidst the reaction that we identify with a neoliberalism. And a lot of what I've written is about the initial surge of workers claiming rights and immigrants claiming rights and women claiming rights and making some progress and then immediately facing a backlash in the courts, in the legislatures, in popular culture. And so we see this kind of movement forward and movement back. And so I've always been big on trying to show, well, here's the possibilities of legal rights claiming amidst sort of neoliberalism, but here's the constraints. Now, and that's always made my work have this kind of guarded pessimism. On one hand, I want to celebrate aspirations of people who are struggling for rights, people who are struggling for justice, struggling to expand egalitarian entitlements, not just legally, but also socially, to increase their power at work, in society, over their lives. So I've always tried to celebrate aspiration, but I've also been very focused on the constraints, the difficulties of doing that, and the way that lots of movements that I'd like to celebrate have been very limited in the kinds of gains that they have made. And this is all in this sort of era of neoliberal backlash, to some degree. To me, begins really 1969 or 1970 and continues on. So when I'm thinking about kind of conditions, and of course, neoliberalization, and as we have increasingly a world capitalist order, neoliberalization affects countries all over the world, legal systems all over the world. Neoliberalism certainly leaves its imprint within Europe and certainly in the global South as well. And I can't get into that for now. And this brings me back to the observation I began with, which is I think that the resurgence of liberalism and then the shift into what we call neoliberalism and the backlash against rights claiming and populations that have tried to become part of the liberal order and then have been rebuffed often, to some degree at least, is very much about its stake for what happened with what we call the rise of autocratic legalism or populism. That it's the failure of liberalism to make good on its promises. That all of a sudden, we recognize that everybody should have rights and be part of a liberal legal order, but in fact, in reality, there's still continuing extreme social inequality. And in fact, in the United States and in much of the world, that economic inequality continues to grow dramatically from the 1970s forward. So say, well, I'm a citizen now, and I'm supposed to be treated equally, but I have less income, I have less stability, less control over my work. The reality of social inequality in the face of that promise of being a rights-bearing member of the liberal community becomes obvious. And that's where we get a lot of resentment from the people who are kicked out, but you also get a lot of resentment from people, especially white Americans, who think that they're being harmed to try and make good on redistribution, either of rights or of wealth or of economic power to those who historically were put out. So we get this polarization around resentments on a variety of different sides. And that's why liberalism becomes sort of the object of a lot of scorn from the new autocrats and the new populists. I put a book here, Chaos and Liberal Order, which is all about Trump taking on liberalism, which is surprising to a lot of people. And then one of his cohort, Liars, Leakers, and Liberals by Judge Janine Pirro, again, blaming liberals. Liberalism is the problem. It's no longer the solution. And we get these trends. We see here President Trump beginning, but he hated Obama. There's no doubt about that. And a lot of this in the United States has been backlash against Obama, the first mixed race or black president. I'd say mixed race president. The backlash was palpable. And I should say it's even greater. I was writing about racial capitalism and all that in between 2010 and 2020, and even I was surprised by the degree of the backlash, but it's palpable. So you get in Trump and then increasingly wearing this sort of populist mantle, celebrating Putin and then Orban, and so what are the tenets of this? And this is where I'm going to wrap up here. One of the things that strikes me most is that the challenges of the new autocrats, or the old autocrats, if we include Putin and others in that, is that they are not outside or opposed to law. In the United States, I had I used to do a PowerPoint for undergraduates, right? There are 3 pages of nothing but newspaper headlines about how Trump was undermining the rule of law. And I say, you know, that's one way to look at it. But another way to look at it is he very much believes in law. He hates liberal judges and liberal lawyers and the FBI and election officials and immigrants and people who claim rights and all that. But he's not outside of law, he's very much in law. And in fact, he uses law all the time. Trump is probably the most litigious president in the history of the United States. He made his whole career as a real estate mogul filing lawsuits against people, either to stop things from happening or to protect himself. And he's always had a big battalion of lawyers. He's in court all the time. He would always ally with his judges, just like his generals and his FBI people. And he would, you know, he's often complains about the violation of his rights and the rights of people that he represents, is the poor white people whose rights are being taken away by black people demanding affirmative action and the like. And he's not opposed to elections. He wants to fix the election. He just wants to fix it so that he can win, right? You know, and so there's a strange way in which he's working within the law and using law, but he's using law in a way that undercuts the liberal promises of law. He's using the conventions and the institutions and the discourses of inherited liberal law and neoliberal law, but he uses that for quite some for neoliberal, but certainly against the grain of liberal principles and liberal ends. A lot's been written about the new autocrats, not just Trump, but others, about how he weaponizes law. He takes these from, he's not anti-law, he embraces it and turns it for his own purposes, which are often selfish and autocratic and exclusionary and hierarchical and racist and sexist and so forth. Okay? And that complicates both understanding what's going on, and I think certainly the American media has had a hard time with this. It's a lot easier to say he's opposed to law than to say, well, he actually has his own version of rule of law or rule by law or whatever we want to call it. I just put up this because I like the cartoon here. Anyhow, but as you probably know, Trump had fashioned an executive order which banned immigrants from predominantly Muslim nations. And that became a big issue. I was actually very active in Seattle in protesting that at the airports, which was very successful for a moment and then failed when the High Court ruled that his travel ban was okay once he cleansed it of its explicitly racist and ethnocentric language. And I just like this picture of him there hugging the flag. That's what he does with law. He hugs law, but it's his own version, right? He hides behind it and he turns it into a weapon for his own purposes. And again, this is the parallel that I see what's gone on in Trump's America. I don't want to make too much of Trump because this has been going on for a long time. Trump is simply the person and the force who momentarily took it another level and triumphed through these strategies. But this has been going on quite a while, for many decades to some degree. And you see the parallels. When Trump identified, Trump's heroes were not only Andrew Jackson, who made his name in American history as an Indian fighter in genocide of the indigenous people, but also was a slave owner and defended the slave order and all that. I mean, his heroes are anything but what we think of as liberal defenders of rights for all people, but around the world. Putin, obviously, Orban, Bolsonaro, Modi, to some degree the Chinese state. And it's strange that Trump was always kind of ambivalent about the Chinese state, which has also found ways to use law, rule of law conventions and rights in legal institutions as a way to expand authoritarian capitalism, which is both unaccountable to the population and also tramples over people's rights, or at least and basically treats people differently. Urban workers and rural workers, for example, are treated very differently under Chinese law in a way that's not all that dissimilar from the history of the dual state in America. I cite an essay by Martin Krieger, my good friend, and co-editor at the Annual Review of Law and Social Sciences. Countries that only a few years ago were fated for ushering a third wave of democracy and the rule of law are today being inundated by what has variously been called abusive constitutionalism, stealth constitutionalism, constitutional coups, autocratic legalism, abuse of the Constitution, and the twisting and turning of the rule of law. Again, all of this is from within law, but it's effort to turn that against the liberalism that we often identified with the rule of law. At the Annual Review of Law and Social Science, and I, with my co-editors, have been sponsoring a whole series of papers about this around the world. My paper that I based this talk in part on was about the US, but it's trying to link to sort of identify these various trends around the world. And what this paper by Fabio Silva is really interesting about how liberalism is, is fed with loopholes and problems and contradictions that enabled this populism to arise. But the key question that I want to raise that's central for this conference, I think, is about what happens to the politics of rights claiming when liberal principles, liberal ends, liberal goals are basically subverted, weaponized, and then turned to quite illiberal ends. Politics of rights always depends on challenging elites to live up to what they say. You say you believe in liberal law and rights for everybody, but that's not the system we have. That's not what you do. How do we challenge you to make good on what you say? But when you have leaders like Trump and Putin and Orban and so forth, who have a very different conception of law, you can't exploit the hypocrisy, the gap between what they say and what they do. In fact, they're fairly transparent about what it is that they're doing. So what happens to the politics of rights? And that's mainly a question that I think we'll probably be talking about for the next few days. One is that just a withering of the institutional opportunities and resources for claiming rights and for promoting a greater rights and opportunities for people. A second is that the coexistence of illiberal law and liberal law, liberal law provides a way to fight back against illiberalism and challenge it and prevail in the end. Or maybe what we need to do, and this is what I try to do in my book on Filipino Canada workers, is look back in the past. You say, what can we learn from earlier experiences of people who were not granted citizenship rights, who were not admitted into the community of rights-bearing people, but were struggling for basic rights and status and for power in the modern society? Can we learn anything from that earlier period? I'm skeptical. And a lot of people are writing about this, do we need a new playbook for politics of rights in the contemporary era? And I just put this one work up here. So I'm out. I put this, because I use this at the beginning of my book. From the history of the enslaved, we might make our way back toward the question of rights. I guess I've come convinced, thinking about the history of rightsless people and the development of law that we, to some degree think, well, we won the battle for liberalism, now we have to fight for more social equality. And now it turns out that that battle was not won and it's something different. What can we learn historically? And I'll probably try and do something. So that's it. I'm sorry. How much over did I go? I'm sorry. Okay. All right.